The Sufi poems of Hafiz, there's a number of words that have different symbolic meanings. Some of these words are symbolism generally used in Sufism, and others are symbolism that's particular to Hafiz because of Hafiz's background, because of the time where he was living and the place where he was living. Sufi schools always try to adapt themselves to the place and time where they are. So no two Sufi schools will look the same. They'll always be radically different and sometimes even seem contradictory to what other Sufi schools were trying to instruct. And this is, it's not intentional, but it's a byproduct of the Sufis' desire to keep only the essential and to let the external, the non-essential, be adapted over time, so that instead of having a fixed form that ends up with a dead religion, you have living mystery schools that are always changing their appearance, but that are maintaining the real. This is because spiritual movements always end up having to choose eventually between keeping what is essential or keeping what is non-essential. To keep what's essential, then you need to be willing to change and transform the non-essential parts. If you mistake the external, the non-essential parts, for the essential, then you're going to end up becoming stratified, and traditions will form, and those traditions will become meaningless, and you'll end up with a religious institution. This is part of the reason why the Sufis, and in Hafiz's poems it shows in particular, were relatively against the Muslim priesthood, because Islam had by then had that happen to it, where it had become stratified with traditions and was not adapting, and the priests were not any more spiritual than anyone else. They were just better at following these traditions. So the most important symbol that appears again and again in Sufi poetry, and especially in Hafiz, is the beloved. And the beloved is interpreted at many different levels. The beloved can be the love person that the love poem is referring to. But if you're looking at it from the deeper level, then the beloved is actually meant to reflect the divine. So sometimes the beloved is a code word for God or for the divine experience. And sometimes the beloved is also a code word for your Sufi master, because you see the divine in him. Another word that's a code for the Sufi master is the friend. The friend is the code for the Sufi master's human apparition, for his human form. So the friend is the term for the Sufi teacher who initiated you. The tavern in Sufi poetry is a reference to the meeting place of the school, the temple where they would come together, or the lodge. Sometimes it was a tavern. And the wine that is served is, at that spiritual interpretation of the Sufi poem, the experience of consciousness, of divine presence, of being in the moment. So the wine is the spiritual experience. The saki, which is a term that you'll hear in the Sufi poems, saki was the person at a tavern who would serve wine. And in the Sufi context, the saki is really a reference to the brothers of the Sufi who's writing the poem, to the brothers in spirit, the other members of the school, what in the Hindu context is called the Sangha, so the spiritual school. There are many other references also to elements that come not so much from Sufi teaching, but from the Persian culture. There are many references to Alexander, and there they're talking about Alexander the Great. There's reference to Alexander the Great having a mirror, which is part of an old story of Persian mythology, that Alexander the Great had a mirror that he could use to see the whole world. You'll hear reference also to Jam's cup, which is the story of another person who had this cup that could see inside the whole world. And so obviously these are mythological stories, but that also have a spiritual element to them. You'll hear reference to Solomon, and there they're speaking of King Solomon, the same one from the Old Testament, who Sufis consider one of their great teachers. The Sufis do not believe that their teaching is only limited to Islam. There were Sufi teachers that were all over the world in different moments and in different contexts. And so Solomon was the one that constructed the temple in Jerusalem, and he was seen as a great figure of wisdom and understanding. My video seems to have cut out there. Sorry about that. I'm trying to put this all together in one video now. There are a number of other symbolic elements that you can find in the Sufi poetry. The nightingale, the rose, the warm wind or zephyr. These are all different secret Sufi symbols. The rose is a reference to the heart, and the nightingale to the feeling of emotion and of longing. And the zephyr is meant to reflect the higher consciousness. You'll find a lot of references to these symbols again and again in Hafiz's poetry, when he's talking about either the longing that he feels for connecting to the beloved, because these poems are essentially about the spiritual process, the spiritual path. And in many of these poems, Hafiz is writing from the point of view of his condition prior to awakening, where he was filled with this desire, this effort, this sense of desperation to connect to the divine, and the frustrations that he would encounter along the path. Many of the poems are kind of an instruction from the negative point of view of what not to do and how not to approach the spiritual path. I'm sure that there's quite a few other symbols that I might have left out in this brief introduction, but if I run into others when I'm recording some of these other poems, I'll make a commentary about them at the end of the poem.